we're already in a beautiful conversation. Uh, the best part of every episode is obviously the technical, the
Right.
technical check and the like. This is why I think in-person conversations are just, I mean, they're just easier because we've been doing them for millions and millions of years. We know how to do them, and here we are in a
Yes.
place where a lot can go wrong before we can actually communicate, which is shocking to me.
Yeah. Well, it might be a little bit like talking about the weather before you get into a conversation.
I think it's a little different because when you're talking about the weather, you're still in it. So I feel like, I mean, this is maybe a fundamental place to start, Anjan, is that like we are biological beings in these bodies that have been kind of the way they are for a long time, millions of years, and we're living in a very different world. And I feel like there's a big gap between what we've evolved for and the ways we've evolved and the context that we're living in these days. Is that an understatement?
I think that is an accurate, perhaps understatement. I sometimes give talks that are titled, or a main theme is an old brain trapped in a new environment. So it's
Yeah.
exactly that idea of how our brains evolved to deal with a certain environment, which is very, very different than uh, how we find ourselves living right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, your work in your book, which you wrote almost a decade ago now, if that's which
Yeah,
is
it's been
crazy.
10 years.
Congratulations. Um, we can talk about how you're celebrating it later. Um, you limit the conversation to specific areas where the research supports being able to talk about the brain and its relationship to aesthetics and beauty. And I'm wondering what you've learned in the last 10 years that can help us think about beauty around dialogue and conversations. Like, how do we think about what we know about the brain as you as a scientist and us as people with this thing that we're doing, talking to each other, and how beauty plays a role in that? Where could we possibly safely start?
I think we can start with some of the points I was making in that book, and we've subsequently used as a framework to think about beauty. So that applies to the sorts of things I talk about in the book, beauty of people, beauty of places, beauty of things, in this case, art,
Mm,
which turns out to be quite a mysterious kind of object. But then using a broader framework to ask the question, does this apply to other things like conversation? And
yeah.
so just to lay that out, we have been for some time using this framework that we call the aesthetic triad.
Mm,
And that has three components broadly. One is the kind of sensory motor aspects of whatever you're engaging with, the sensuality of it. The second has to do with the emotions that are evoked in the encounter. And the third has to do with the kind of knowledge and meaning that you both bring to it and that you
mm,
get out of it. So if we tried to map that kind of thinking onto a conversation, I would think that there is a kind of rhythm and musicality to a conversation that would be akin to the sort of sensory qualities. You know,
mm,
you could imagine with the kind of digital technology we have that you could keep all of the acoustic parameters and fuzz out the words so you don't get the meaning, but you get a
mm-hmm.
kind of get the sound and the musicality of a conversation, and people might have opinions on was that a beautiful set of interactions or not.
Yeah.
Um, the emotions, which can be quite varied, but most people would have an intuition if there's a sense of well-being and a fondness in the conversation and those kinds of positive affects. It doesn't mean that the whole conversation needs to be saccharine and just with no tension,
Mm,
but overall there is a kind of appeal and a pleasure out of the conversation. And then the semantics piece, I would think, would be where both people are bringing, as they have to, their own background to the conversation, but they're also getting something. There's an exchange there of ideas, there's an exchange of information. And so
yeah.
I think that's one way that you can think of how to apply this triad that we apply to art, we apply to everything, could also apply to conversations as well.
Yeah, and I really appreciated that you talked about beauty in relationship to mathematics. So,
Hmm.
my background, my first degree is in physics, and I remember when someone came out with an article about like the 10 most beautiful experiments in the
Yeah.
history of physics. And it's a really interesting idea to think about, the double slit ex- experiment as like, well, that's just beautiful. And so there's this idea of elegance and
Hmm.
something that's parsimonious. Like it's not, there's nothing extraneous. There's a leanness to it. And while it seems like it comes on the knowledge side of the aesthetic triangle, there's clearly also emotions that are triggered. And I feel like some of this has to do with what you talk around the beauty bias. Like when we see beautiful people and beautiful things, we treat them differently than things that we think of as unbeautiful. And I
Yeah.
imagine in science that is just a messy proof, and like I don't really know if I agree with your process, but it's an interesting idea. Have How do you think about this beauty bias? And I mean, on one hand, I think we'd want to take advantage of it. On the other hand, we might want to try to mitigate it. How should we be thinking about that?
Yeah. So beauty is seductive, and for all that entails,
Mm,
both good and bad. The Sometimes when I talk about this, I talk about our brains are very good at discriminating between objects, right? You can tell this is a face, this is a tree. With faces, where most of us are especially expert, you have what is sometimes referred to as one trial learning. You can see a person once and then
mm,
you remember them, right? There are not a lot of things. You just need to experience once. So we're very good at discriminating between objects. We are not good at discriminating between our values. And so, if you think about the Greeks talked about beauty, truth, and goodness as core human values, we're not very good at separating those. We tend to conflate those all the time. And so when it comes to science, ostensibly we're all in search of truth of some kind.
mm,
And there is a way in which beauty can intersect with that seeking of truth, seeking of knowledge. And that can both be, it can be used, as you say. So every scientist I know, when we publish papers and we're making our figures, we want to make sure our figures are beautiful,
mm.
right? And there's a kind of sense that if someone finds a figure attractive, that along with that will come a certain kind of acceptance of what the figure is supposed to be depicting.
Yeah.
Now, physics to me is an interesting case because my understanding, and I'm not a physicist, but I've heard some of these conversations, is there's a bit of a controversy within physics, which is if a theory is beautiful and elegant, it must be true. And to me, it's not obvious that that's the case, right? It could
Yeah.
be that the world is messier and, but we like something that is elegant and something that is beautiful. And so it becomes a matter of human psychology and not about the nature of the world outside of us that
Yeah.
biases us to prioritizing beautiful theories. It's just a possibility, but it's the kind of thing in another setting, which I think you alluded to, that we have fairly good evidence of how when we encounter people who are attractive, we tend to think they are good.
Yeah.
And the converse of that, which is quite disturbing, and we've done a lot of work on this, is when people have facial anomalies. So things like scars or burns or birth defects, that there is an implicit bias where most people will think that they're less hardworking, less competent, less trustworthy, and so on, with clearly with no basis.
Sure.
And so that's a clear example where I think the conflation of beauty, and in this case, goodness rather than truth, seems to be a common phenomena that we would like to reject as not having something to do with how the world actually is.
So for someone who, I mean, is it really just about being aware of the bias? Is that the only way to mitigate it? It's on the side of the receiver, the experiencer, to just be aware that. And I've been aware of this, by the way. I know you talk about the peak shift rule,
Hmm.
um, and how there's so many things in our environment that are designed to take something that is already beautiful and attractive to us and just shove it way to the edge of what wouldn't really occur in nature, and it
Yeah,
is deeply overstimulating to us. Like
yeah.
it's I'm already starting to have that dialogue with myself where I'm like, oh, Dr. Chatterjee's told me about this. Like I'm aware that my brain's over responding to something, and I'm just gonna sort of co-regulate with myself on that. Is it really just being aware of our own bias in that sense?
I think being aware is certainly the first step. And the other thing I sometimes talk about is that this is the first reflexive reaction. But we have all of this brain machinery, our prefrontal cortex, and all of the other stuff that regulates our reactions, that allows us uh, to uh, decide how to behave based on those actions.
Yeah,
One of the things that we have gotten very interested in particularly in this idea that people with facial anomalies are treated in such a way, uh, is that something that our culture then promotes? And this may go back to your peak shift idea. And we have been finding, and when I say this, most people realize it, that in our popular media, particularly movies, if you think about villains and how they're depicted in movies, so the Bond
sure.
villains, the Marvel universe, any number of these, that the villains are often depicted with facial disfigurements. And the idea behind that is that you don't have to develop a backstory. It's shown on the screen. The audience immediately understands the code. This is bad person. And we feed our kids this.
Yeah.
So things like The Lion King, right? Scar, the only character that doesn't get a name, or his name is
Yeah.
his Scar.
He also has a British
Uh,
accent. That just telegraphs it. I feel there's this whole thing about
well, the British accent goes either way for Americans. I think
fair.
people
I feel
really
like a
like.
lot of bad, the bad people have to have that. It's the same thing in Star Wars. They all have these the all the people from the Empire have these British accents. I'm not sure
Yeah,
why.
yeah, yeah.
But you're right, Emperor Palpatine, speaking of the Star Wars, it's like yes, he becomes horribly disfigured when
Right.
you realize
And
how
Darth
evil he
Vader,
is.
that's and Darth
100%.
Vader, that's the same story, same backstory. Even in the recent things, think about the the recent productions of Dune, the Harkonnen, the sort of evil aliens, all have
Yes.
alopecia universalis, right? There are
Mm,
people around that have this condition where they don't have hair. And, there's this kind of message being sent out that, evil aliens, and we're surrounded by this. And so we looked at this. It's a paper under review right now, last 50 years of Hollywood movies, and we looked at last 20 years of Bollywood movies to have another cultural comparison,
mm,
and use IMDb. So we're not hand selecting the images to look at how these facial anomalies are depicted among heroes and villains. And we see that for both, it's actually gone up in this, but the nature of the scars in villains tend to be larger. They tend to really cover kind of midline structures where our attention typically is orients to when we're looking at faces, as opposed to kind of off in the corner of the forehead.
Mm-hmm.
Like Harry Potter or Humphrey Bogart, for example, had a little scar there.
Yeah.
That makes you look tough in a way. So,
Yeah.
so there are those kinds of cultural biases, I think. So going back to your question is what can we do about it? Part of it is to be both individually aware, but communally and socially aware. So there are these organizations. There's one in England that had a whole campaign called I Am Not Your Villain, where real people with facial anomalies would do these ads with that as the campaign slogan, I'm not your villain.
Yeah. It's so interesting. So when I think about the bias in science
Mhm.
towards, Occam's razor, we're going to the simplest explanation, the most elegant explanation is the most likely one. We have this bias towards
Mhm.
an elegance and beauty, which tells us that it's true. I mean, this is the poem: "Truth, beauty is truth, truth is beauty." That is all you need know on Earth. That's it. Sounds like we need to remember to bring a willingness to wade through some complexity and to accept that complexity is not ugly and complexity might be true in as much as simplicity could be true. And that's a real check on each one of us as we're gathering together and deliberating, having discussions, deciding things together. That natural bias for simplicity, just like to really look at it maybe
Yeah, I
once or
couldn't
twice
agree
more.
more. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Another idea that comes up a lot in aesthetics research is the notion of unity and diversity, right? That there is something unifies, trying to unify a whole bunch of diverse phenomena. And this can be in a painting, is there something that unifies all of uh, discrete elements? And I think that gets at both the simplifying, looking for the unity, but at the same time not discarding the complexity, that it
Mm,
doesn't reduce to the center, right? It encompasses the center, but still reaches out to all of these peripheral, complicated, messy elements.
yeah. So interesting. I mean, I want to loop back around to what we were starting to point to is what are the elements of a beautiful conversation, especially when we're talking about the complexity of group dialogue and deliberation. We talked about the rhythm, the musicality that we can bring into our voices, right? We can all do work
Mhm.
on our instrument. And I definitely have talked to some of my coaching clients about their awareness that they tend to speak in a monotone and they don't create variety. And there's things that we can do mechanically
Sure.
to bring beauty into our voice. We've talked about being wary of bias towards the elegance of ideas, but it also sounds like it's also a call to learn how to express our ideas, not just so that they literally sound beautiful, but are that they have beauty in terms of their emotional value or their knowledge content. That is a much more subtle thing. What can you tell us about how to how to make people just we're going to harness the bias and just really use it, obviously for good. Um,
Yeah.
how can we harness what we know about the brain to bring more beauty into our group conversations, both in how we present and how we perceive?
So I was thinking about this in the context of conversations, knowing that we were going to have this conversation. And there's a there's an element, when we, at least in my world, when we think of aesthetics, we tend to think of the recipient of stimuli or information. Uh, but the other side of that is the creator, right? The person who's creating something that is an aesthetic experience for the other person. And
Mm,
so in a conversation, it has this to me, very interesting dynamic that we are both uh, experiencer are receivers of the beauty of the conversation and creating the conversation, right?
Yeah.
We're playing both input and output into this thing that we're calling a conversation.
Yeah.
And that creates to me, a kind of interesting dynamic because you're switching back and forth. And so the sorts of questions that come up when we think about creativity, they're the kind of constructs that are often talked about, which is, there are exploration phases where you're loose, and people will
Hmm.
talk about divergent thinking. You kind of, you're not, you sort of meander around ideas and thoughts, and then exploration is often contrasted with exploitation, or divergent thinking with convergent thinking. At some point, you try to nail it down, and this again is analogous to that complexity and then honing it
Mm.
down. So I think the uh, one version of a beautiful conversation, and you do this all the time, so I want to check my intuitions about this with your own experience, um, and your own thoughts about this. But one version is that there is this kind of exploration that happens, but then it also at times has to come down to this exploitation of like to converging on what that exploration delivers. And
Yeah.
on the other side, there's a kind of openness to receiving this. And there are two other fundamental constructs that we think of that people bring to the table when they're having an aesthetic experience or being creative. One is this personality construct that's called openness to experience, which is some people are just
Mm.
more open to experiences,
Mm.
uh, and other people tend to be quite uh, more restrained, conservative, whatever word you want to use. But people who tend to be open to experience tend to be much more willing to engage with art, engage with uh, ambiguity in art. There's a kind of tolerance for ambiguity. And the other is curiosity. We think curiosity is so important as a motivator. And I think both those things also, uh, my intuition, are also true for our beautiful conversations. You have to be open to where it's going to go, and you have to be curious.
Yeah.
And does
Yes.
that comport with your experience? Is that,
Very much so. And so there's a few things I just want to loop back around and highlight. One is just, and
yeah,
I think this is a very fundamental and interesting insight. A conversation is an aesthetic experience merely because our brains are wired to seek and enjoy and delight in beauty and
yeah,
to move away from and reject from it. And the way that I have, I don't know, framed this in my own work, because I came from the design world, is that you are creating an experience and you can either design it intentionally or
mhm,
let it go according to habit. And I think there's a lot of ways that we gather that are quite outmoded, that are not creating what we really want them to create. I just had a client vent about, everyone going to an offsite and them showing a bunch of slides and not having enough time for having dinner together and talking and exploring. She's like, we could have done this on Zoom. We just watched a bunch of slides and just assaulted our brain with information. It was not a very beautiful experience. No one, presumably, was at the wheel saying, what would make this delightful? What would make this aesthetic? What would make this excellent? And one thing that,
time.
oh,
Yeah.
go for it.
I was
No,
going to
please.
say, as I think when we talk, there are certain trigger words that get us. And, you
What's your
mentioned
trigger word?
time,
Yes.
but I meant trigger not in a negative sense, that it triggers a whole set of thoughts.
Yes.
So
Wait, can I guess what you're going to say? Because the PDF you just sent me, there was a very interesting thing about most people spend 27 seconds on a piece of art. Is that what?
that
And if you say
exactly,
you spend 15 minutes with it, you find it more beautiful. And I
yeah.
think with conversations, there's so much going on, and for some reason, a big unwillingness to slow down. The more we slow down, the more we can lavish and languish in the beauty of it, the more we can experience it. How do you get people to slow down?
That's exactly where I was going. So I'm so glad that that
Right, I'm right
happened.
with you. I'm glad you sent me that PDF this morning.
Yeah, so we've been doing this idea of slow looking, and we live in such a manic transactional world, which
Yeah,
I mean it is going back to the current environment we're in, but this idea of slowing down, and I mean you can imagine this how hard it is for students, undergraduate students at my university, University of Pennsylvania, to say, you're going to have to look at this one thing for 15 minutes and you can't pull out your phone. I mean,
excruciating.
it's excruciating. We don't know how to slow down. And correct me
Yeah,
if I'm wrong, I listened to some of your podcasts just to kind of get a sense of how these go. And somewhere there was an offhanded comment, and I hope I have this right, that you're also a chef. Is
well,
that
I wouldn't say I'm a professional chef. I'm more of a food lover that I
okay?
like to both make it and enjoy it,
Yeah.
generally
Well,
in large quantities for my friends.
I like to make it and enjoy it as well, but the analogy there is perfect, right?
Yeah,
We run around with fast food, or I know some years ago I had an Italian postdoc in my lab, and she was horrified to her soul that we had brown bag lunches where you take a brown bag, eat your lunch, and listen to
yeah,
someone lecture. And this idea that food was not the center of attention at lunch. And I think the same idea of savor, like the notion of savoring, I think is really critical for aesthetic
yeah.
experiences, for food or art or conversation. This idea that you slow down, you savor it, and you're not in it as a transition state to the next thing, right? Your mind isn't already
Mm,
uh, oriented to the future while you're in the moment.
yes, very much so. Slow looking is a really, I mean, because we have a slow food movement,
Mhm.
and I love this idea of a slow looking movement, and it really strikes me that science is a slow looking movement of its own. That there is this long arc of history that is about being deliberative and absorbing lots of information, maybe being in conversation with the environment, which I'd love for us to make sure we talk about. Like, how have you experienced in your long career as a scientist what makes good scientific dialogue? Like how to
Yeah.
actually architect that?
So I can tell you about the way I run my lab and
Hmm.
and then how that extends outward. Um, I have, um, people at different levels of training, and especially because of the nature of the work I do, I also have people who are not necessarily trained in psychology and neuroscience. So I have an artist in residence, a senior art historian. I have an anthropologist who also does a bunch of our technical stuff,
Hmm.
like AI and VR, but comes from an anthropology background. I have undergraduates, I have postdocs, right? So that's the kind of mix. And the question is, how do you orchestrate a group
Hmm.
like that? Uh, A curious thing to me is I was at a meeting in Edinburgh a couple of years ago where there were people from the humanities, people from the science, and one thing that came through was many people in the humanities, whether they're philosophers or historians, tend to work in isolation. They kind of do their thing, and then they go out and talk to people or give presentations. We always work in groups. This if there's a myth of the kind of mad scientist in his basement working alone, I've never met that person, right?
Yeah.
Everybody works in groups. And so the question is, how do you orchestrate a group? And this is where food analogies also become
Hmm.
very useful, and I use them all the time, which is how can you orchestrate it so that the whole is greater than some of its parts? And so the way we do it is, so for example, I have four undergraduates. before lab meeting, I meet with them individually for an hour. And it used to be that I would think, okay, what are the ideas that I want them to have, and kind of have that hour session oriented to that. And I since have completely abandoned that, which is rather than that, that whatever I happen to be thinking about or working on is going to be the topic when they come in.
Hmm.
So they don't know what the topic is. I don't know what the topic is. And we use that mostly to help me clarify my ideas, but also it's a way for me uh, to engage them in the conversation because they're just openness. They're not shackled by all the things that I know, right? So they
Yes.
can ask the good questions and they can be my, I often, you know, especially when we're talking about aesthetics, like what kids like these days and, how like fashion works for them, all of like everything is on the table, right? So that's kind of a way to have a conversation where uh, it's not me teaching at them, but having a conversation in which I think, both sides, in this case, the students and I, we're both getting something out of this from each other. Then we move into my lab meeting, and one of the things I've done for years is that everybody uh, gives a report, but we start from the most junior person up.
Hmm.
And the idea is that the most junior, because otherwise you have someone who loves to hear them talk or themselves talk, or someone who is a senior person, intimidates everybody. Start
Hmm.
with the most junior person. When they're on, they have the table, everybody's attention is on them. I don't allow phones, laptops, unless you're looking up a specific paper that had to do with what we're talking about. So you can't have your devices there. The other piece that I've learned to do over the years is that people will do their work updates and then give a little piece of anything they wish to share about their personal life every week. It can be, I went on this date, I went to this restaurant. It can be something like something serious that this person I really care about is very sick. It doesn't matter. I don't prescribe what they say. I don't even prescribe that they do say something personal, but everybody's invited to do so, and it's just become normative. So what happens in this dynamic is that everybody has their turn. Everybody hears about everybody else. It humanizes everybody because you know
Yes.
something about their world. And that provides a vehicle in which then when we actually get down to talking about projects, there is a sort of shared sensibility that just is, it's sort of like I don't know. It's again, to use food analogies always come up. It's like a good roux. You've worked on the roux, and then
Mm.
it's like everything else really, really comes out. And so that's an example, I think, of why working in a group in science internally is very helpful. And one of our mantras is the question is always the question. Like you have to figure out what the question is you want to ask before you
Hmm.
can do anything. And that can take a while.
Yes.
Like what is the question? Why, if we're going to invest some time and energy that's going to take weeks, months, maybe years, let's make sure, let's not rush the first step, which is what is the question? And that's really critical. And so then that sensibility extends outside with my collaborations. I have collaborations all over the world. And for me, a necessary, but perhaps not sufficient, but a necessary condition is I have to like the people.
Hmm.
Uh, and I don't want a transactional relationship. Like you have the skill that I need. I mean, sometimes you have to do that, but really, I want to like the person. And my criteria for people I hire in my lab, people who I collaborate with, is I want to feel like you're a person I can go out and have a beer with or a cup of coffee if you don't drink,
Hmm.
whatever. But have a social thing that has nothing to do with our science. And if I can do that, then I'm willing to play in the science sandbox with you.
Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's a really beautiful outline. Clearly, slow conversation, intentional turn taking, I think, is so important. But you said something right at the end, which I think speaks to a really interesting point that you discuss in your book, which is liking and
Yeah.
wanting and how they
Yeah.
can be different. And it seems like in a way that in order to collaborate with people, we need to see them as you see a skill of theirs as beautiful, needed, wanted, desirable, aesthetic. There's an
Mhm.
aesthetic experience where you need to respect and like this person, either because of presumably where they exist on the triangle, some of the emotions that they evoke in you, some of the knowledge or ideas that they bring to the table. There needs to be an aesthetic harmony in order to collaborate with someone.
I agree. And I think, and I tell my students this all the time when they're kind of thinking about their career of how, if of having the long view, that collaborations and friendships are going to go on for a while. And it's worth investing in the same way that you invest on what's the question, investing in people and
Yes.
people who you think are worth the investment. And that's the kind of sense in which I think conversations in small groups and larger groups and conversation with the larger scientific community makes for better science.
Mm,
When you have that kind of uh, there's a kind of safety, and this is, I think, also important. Once you have the safety built in because you like them and you have this relationship, and everybody is recognized as a real human, not just a data point,
yeah.
then you can be critical of ideas without someone feeling threatened, right?
Yes.
And that's absolutely critical. Like you can't be a softie on the merits of the experiment and the merits of the ideas, right? That has to really be vetted as strongly as you can, but the way that can be done is that you already feel safe with the other people.
Yes. And you have to build that foundation. It's very similar formulation in a way that the folks from the Harvard Negotiation Project talk about being hard on the problem and soft on the people. And often we feel like we have to be soft on the people. But that's if you haven't built the connective tissue to be able to
Right.
be hard on the problem and have that trust and connective
Yeah.
tissue already established. And there's
Yeah.
another piece that you talked about, which is seeing beauty in the long view, understanding that this is a process and that it's gonna take time, and
Yeah.
seeing value in the denouement. In a way, seeing slow looking as beautiful in and of
Yeah.
itself, in a way,
Yeah.
because it is an aesthetic. I talk about it as like taking a bath,
Hmm.
really luxuriating in it. It is shocking to me, by the way, that time has gone rather fast. One of the things I really appreciated when I reached out to you was, and this is something I kind of notice in a conversation, is whether there's an uptake. There's a sense of like a one-sided conversation versus both people pushing and pulling. It's a dance. There's dynamic tension, and I really appreciated the emails that came from you where you're like, "What about group conversations? What about conversations with the environment?" All of these different things that you started to spark in your own brain around conversation. We only have a little bit of time left. Like, what should we talk about that we have not talked about? What's important to make sure that this feels like the most beautiful conversation we could have had?
Well, actually, what I feel bad about is in the balance, and I know that you're the podcast host, I'm the guest, but I would
Yes.
be wanting to ask you all these questions as well, right? So there's an imbalance that I'm a little uncomfortable with. I
I
mean,
know I'm leading I do swing dancing, and we talk about how the leaders
mhm.
is the frame and the follower is the picture. In this case,
Yeah,
I'm leading you, and we can have another I'd be very happy to have another conversation with you where we're equal partners. But for right now, I'm
yeah.
just going to squeeze all of the brain juice I can
All
out of you.
right. So fair enough. Um, I think this you alluded to. I think it's worth at least touching on the idea that we also have a conversation with our environment.
Yeah.
Uh, and makes it maybe a little abstract, but maybe not so. One of the things that became more explicit during the early part of the pandemic, especially the lockdown period, which as separately, it blows my mind that perhaps for the first time in human history, everybody in the world had a version of this shared experience,
Yes.
right? I can't think of any other epoch, whether it's the plague in different parts of Europe or things that have happened in Asia, volcanoes, hurricane, whatever. But everybody was stopped short with this. And, the cultural differences in how it expressed itself, all so on and so forth. But it was a shared experience. And it
Sure.
already feels like that moment of openness is closing rapidly if it hasn't closed already. Like we've
Mm.
forgotten about it. We've suppressed it. We don't.
Yeah, it was
So
one of the rare moments in history where anyone I would talk to, I really wanted to know, how are you? It wasn't like,
yeah,
hey, how's it going? Yeah, let's get to. It was like, how the hell are you? Because I don't know. Because you're going through. I just sort of, I assume everyone's actually kind of going through some stuff anyway now.
yeah,
But really, then you're like, how are you? We really
yeah.
wanted to know. It was a very different vibe.
Very different vibe. So the other piece about that was it made us very explicitly aware of our environment in a way that we
Hmm.
typically don't, again, in that kind of transactional, fast moving. So it's almost like a slow living of, all of a sudden, I've had that painting on my wall for, 30 years and I don't even notice it anymore, right? During the time, what you can't see is to my right, there's a window and we have a little courtyard. I live in Center City, Philadelphia, so it's a very
Hmm.
urban area. I got, like many people, I got a bunch of plants and I also got a bird feeder, right? So I'm looking at this stuff, right? So this idea that
Hmm.
we are in conversation with our environment all the time. And going back to something we started before is that if we evolved, our brains adapted to a certain version of nature over the 1.8 million years of the Pleistocene, it's only been in the last 10, maybe 12,000 years that we've all been sequestered in these indoor places, and that this has increasingly got us more and more removed from
Hmm.
nature.
Yeah.
We're in hermetically sealed environments. Earlier in our conversation, there was a buzz, that was the heater going on, right? That's already saying, nope, keep the real world out there.
Yeah.
Uh, Incandescent lights, all of a sudden we're no longer tied to diurnal rhythms.
Hmm.
1872, I think, is when Thomas Edison first turned on the first light bulb in Menlo Park. There's a way in which that disrupted us. And so all these questions now that emerge out of things like sustainability, the environmental concerns, I think all in a way can be framed as a disruption in the conversation we would be having with our environment. And so that
Yes.
was the piece, and how architecture either helps or hurts in that.
Oh, yeah.
You've talked about design. How do you design your environment? And this is something I'm very preoccupied by right now. How do you design your environment, the built environment, in a way that honors that conversation with the environment?
It's a really interesting point, and I'll link in the show notes. I many uh, episodes ago, I interviewed Tyson Yunkaporta, who's an Aboriginal Australian, and he wrote a book called Sand Talk, and really pointing to the fact that there's this in science, there's this idea of embodied cognition. Oh, isn't this
Mhm.
interesting? We think in spaces, and he's was saying, yes, we've been sitting in circles drawing on the sand together for 1.8 million years.
Mhm.
We've had conversations in places and spaces where we can point and gesture and use that as a way of describing where we want to go, what we want to do. I personally believe that a conversation with a whiteboard is it's a multimodal, 6-dimensional conversation instead of what another guest, Dave Gray, we would call an air conversation. This is just an air conversation. And air does not have much of a memory. The environment 100% has a lot to do with what conversation is even possible.
Mhm. Yeah.
God, I've been in so many offices where you're not even allowed to put anything on the walls, and I feel hampered. It's like I can't use one of my hands because embodied cognition, I think, is such an important component of how we can think
Yeah.
together with multiple people, is to use all the things around us. So this rock represents this, and this represents that, and to be able to use that as a dialogical aid, I think, is so important. So I think your intuition and your experience is 100% correct. In the same way that having phones and laptops in the conversation creates an environment that is irreparably non-aesthetic, in the sense of being able to actually host a beautiful conversation because nobody can focus.
And, just not to put too fine a point on this, as often has been mentioned by the previous Surgeon General and others, we're an epidemic of loneliness. And, loneliness is, at least one version of this, is the absence of good conversation.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I appreciate so much you taking the time out of your work to have what I hope is a good conversation
Maybe
with
even a
me,
beautiful one.
maybe even a beautiful one. Um, uh, and if people would like to learn more about your work, I definitely would direct them to reading your book, uh, The Aesthetic Brain. We'll link to that. Is there any other place where they should go to stay in the loop with your work?
Yeah, our website,
Wonderful.
we have updates of what's going on. We have little videos of things there. That's a good place. I have both a LinkedIn and a Blue Sky account where I mostly post sort of updates of things we've been doing. So, for example, this interview, when it comes out, will show up there, but
Wonderful.
other things as well.
And is the year in
So
the review there on the website? I can put a
I
link to
I
that if it is.
placed it on. I just last week put it on LinkedIn.
Oh,
Yes.
wonderful. Because it's great stuff. It's like a gloss almost
Hmm.
on everything around your work. Um, I'm just gonna officially thank you for coming on the show, and I'm really grateful for your time. It has been a beautiful conversation for me. You've been very generous, so thank you very much.
Well, I very much appreciate your inviting me, and yeah, this was great.
Wonderful. So that means we can call scene, and I can pause the conversation.